My landlord, who is entitled to sue me, is making false accusations that I was culpable for the irresponsibility of this individual, and that I had damaged his property. However, I was determined not to accept that. Consequently, I not only prevailed in court, but I also compelled him to return all of the money he owed me. I have never been more pleased to have defeated an individual in my life. This is what transpired. Therefore, in order to establish a context, my initial spouse was not an especially agreeable individual. He treated me as a baby factory and belittled me for 6 years. He was an exceptional father, but he was an unhappy husband. He continued to treat me inhumanely until I awoke and made the decision to depart from him after he finally acquired his progeny. Now, this vengeance narrative is not about him, however. I needed to establish the context for the events that are to unfold. I departed the residence with my computer, vehicle, and clothing. I possessed nothing. Before locating a deplorable townhouse with roommates, I spent a few weeks at the residence of my closest acquaintance. I was able to acquire a cat urine-free couch that served as my bed, as I lacked any furnishings. In the end, I was employed in 3 or 4 positions, one of which was full-time. On a weekly basis, I was unable to sleep between jobs, which required me to remain awake for approximately 48 hours daily. I have concluded my year-long lease for my townhouse, and my divorce has been finalized 1 year later. When my children visited me, I had equipped the house, my chamber, and their rooms as a result of my diligent efforts. During my tenure as a tenant, my landlord was generally a kind and considerate individual. I was a responsible tenant. I never missed a rent payment, and despite having housemates, I was the sole individual listed on the lease. Occasionally, my landlord would arrive at my residence with a group of individuals with whom he had to collaborate on tasks such as plumbing inspections or any other reason he could conjure up. He would linger and attempt to engage in conversation with me with vaguely sexual overtones, which made me feel somewhat uneasy. Was satisfied, and I was now on a month-to-month contract. This meant that I was prepared to relocate from this unappealing townhouse and locate a pleasant residence in the nearby mountains. I was genuinely elated because, now that I have my feet on the ground, I can finally afford to live somewhere other than the slums. In order to vacate, I was required to provide 1 month's notice as stipulated in my lease. Regrettably, I was able to reserve the residence that I intended to relocate to in the upcoming month, despite the fact that it was only 3 weeks away. The landlord communicated to me that I intended to vacate the premises at the conclusion of this month, which was precisely 3 weeks away. He also stated that he would endeavor to secure an alternative tenant. However, if he was unsuccessful, I would continue to fulfill my legal obligation and pay the rent for the following month. He responded to my email within a week, 2 weeks prior to my scheduled departure, and informed me that, despite the generous nature of my offer, he had successfully secured a new tenant for the beginning of the following month. Consequently, I was essentially relieved of my obligations. He had already collected a deposit from them. Subsequently, an incident transpired that was not my responsibility. Neither do my colleagues. The townhouse was equipped with its own appliances, including a refrigerator and an oven, as well as a washer and dryer on the main level. My housemate had completed a load of laundry and retired to the living room to take a nap. He arose to find that the washer's sensory switch had malfunctioned, resulting in the water filling without halting. In the kitchen and living room, there was an inch of water. He interrupted the washing process by splashing through the water and calling for my help. I was merely leaving work when I hurried home to assess the extent of the damage, and I warn you, it was severe. There was approximately 1 inch of water in the kitchen and stagnant water on the carpet in the living room. I contacted the proprietor and provided a detailed explanation of the circumstances. I had already cleared the majority of the stagnant water with the assistance of my flatmate and friends, who arrived with shop vacs by the time the landlord arrived. The landlord did not seem to be agitated, which caught me off guard. They were accompanied by the client's repairman, who was on his way to inspect the washer. The repairman even said, "Yep, here's the culprit," and showed him that the dial would stick on the fill stage and wouldn't click over to the agitate stage. After replacing the dial and the lubricating for the whole dial, he eventually left. The next week was chaos as I was busy trying to pack, and the landlord had insurance guys in the house assessing the damage for any claims, and workers were taking out the carpet and cutting 2 feet worth of the lower drywall of the whole main level. Day of the move. Though I was still supposed to be there for a couple more days, the landlord had let himself in as movers were moving out my stuff with a camera going around taking pictures of everything. I honestly thought that this was for his insurance claims. I actually felt bad for the landlord at the time, and I told him that I would not ask for any of my deposit back, and he responded in front of the loading crew and my roommate, "Thank you. That's very generous of you." We eventually parted ways, and I thought that was that. But boy, was I wrong. 2 weeks into my new home location, my previous landlord showed up on my doorstep with a summons to appear in arbitration because he was suing me. So I thought to myself, what are you talking about? On what grounds is he suing me on? He stated it's all in this paperwork and handed me a manila envelope with 18 pages of everything he was charging me with, all of which including photos, so now I knew why he was taking pictures in the first place. Nickel and diming me on everything, from scuffs on the wall to bent-up objects. And then he also wanted me to pay his insurance deductible, as well as the following month's rent. He claimed that the tenants that he had lined up backed out at the last minute, claiming drywall and painting they still had to do. So he still wanted me to pay that month's rent. I thought to myself, really? No, I don't think so. I knew I was more than generous of giving him my whole deposit, and then for him to come back and sue me for thousands of dollars. He was not only claiming the damages caused by the flood, but also improvements he needed to do that should never be or have been my responsibility in the first place. Even cracks in the living room wall that was from the building settling. How should I be responsible for that? He wanted new lighting, new faucets, all mainly on the accusation that I was being negligent. But you know what? I wasn't going to have any of that. I know that this place was a slummy townhouse complex and most of his tenants were on welfare. Maybe he could get away with this with other people, but absolutely not me. No way. I had just got out of a marriage that made me feel insignificant and I had horrible self-esteem. But now I had my dignity and I felt strong for the first time in a long time. No way was I going to let any more garbage happen to me without doing something about it. I had 10 days before the date of my arbitration meeting. I immediately got to work. First, getting a signed deposition from the very repairman that had showed up that day, stating that the appliance was quite in need of maintenance work, and the last time he had done any maintenance for him was almost 5 years before. From thoroughly reviewing my rental contract and the local laws, the landlord is obligated to have all appliances maintained and serviced every single year. I had also talked to some of the other tenants and had heard that this wasn't the first time that this landlord had sued tenants after the fact. I hunted them down and got sworn statements from them as well. Unfortunately for them, they didn't know what to do and mostly didn't show up to arbitration, hence why the landlord would be winning by default. But there was absolutely no way I was going to let him do that to me. I then drew up a rebuttal to each and every claim he had, including photos from the year that I had lived there, email correspondence, and even convinced my ex-roommate and one of the movers that heard my interaction with the landlord about him, stating how generous it was of me letting him keep my whole deposit, which was, by the way, a significant amount. The day of the arbitration comes around and I dressed up in my power suit, and with my ex-roommate and worker in tow, I showed up at the meeting. Now in Canada, arbitration is not held in a courtroom per se, but it still is held at the courthouse in a conference room with a judge. Since the landlord was the plaintiff, he got to go first in the case. He spent over 40 minutes going over everything, and I sat quietly until he finished. Once he finished, I then hauled out the rebuttal in multiple copies, handed it to the judge, to the landlord, and anyone else that wished to have one, and I quickly went over each point. The landlord was irate and interrupted almost every second sentence I spoke. I would pause the moment he would start talking, and I would say sweetly, I was quiet and polite during your time to your case. I hope you grant me the same respect. The landlord started to get red in the face, especially when I got to the deposition of the maintenance worker for the appliance. I included with that the Tenancy and Landlord Act sections pertaining to appliance maintenance and stated that this was the only record of maintenance that had occurred, and unless he can come up with more recent records from perhaps another company. It was over 5 years since anything had been looked at. With my defense, I had also then countered that I would like my deposit back and my day's pay from work since I had to take that day off to go to this meeting. The judge then made his statement, and I will always remember this for the rest of my life. He stated that first he was very impressed by my presentation, and that I obviously have a good handle on things, and can tell that my nature is of kindness and respect, especially with photos of how I had the townhouse furnished and how clean and how much pride I put into it, as well as with any home that I would live in. The bottom line is that not only did I win my case, I wound up having my landlord owing me over 80% of my deposit back. The landlord's face was priceless. The judge then proceeded to tell this landlord that they will be reviewing again all of his previous filings, and if there was enough evidence of him mistreating previous tenants, he would be reported to the Board of Landlords and Tenants. Now I walked away that day feeling on top of the world, completely justified, and he got a taste of his own medicine, but it didn't stop there. Oh no. Knowing that this guy has a history of suing tenants, I printed up my final results, the ones with the judge's signature, and I gave a copy to each and every tenant in that complex. I wanted to warn everyone of his practices and to keep notes, photos, and everything, so that he couldn't do that to them. But I didn't stop there. He still owed me money, and I asked repeatedly for the payment. But he never responded. He had until a certain day to pay me back my deposit, and on that day I had gone to his house and knocked on the door. He didn't answer the door even though I knew he was home. I rang the bell a few more times and knocked very loudly. He then turned his house alarm on. which at first startled me but quickly turned to humor, because I was seeing just how much of a coward this bully was turning out to be. I then yelled loud enough that I'm not going anywhere. He then yells, "Get off my property or I'm going to call the police." So I think, okay, no problem. I get off the property, but I camped out on the front sidewalk. I had a fold-up chair, a cooler with water and sodas, a few sandwiches and all my paperwork with me. I was set to stay there forever. People there from the house alarm fiasco about how I was a tenant, and this guy wrongfully sued me, and that I have a claim against him, and he now owes me money. I let anyone look at the paperwork too, by the way, just to back up my claim. The police eventually did show up. They first went to talk to the landlord, and he was claiming that I was bothering him, while also making the unjust claim that I was slandering him, and that I wouldn't leave his property. But I was on public property, meaning the sidewalk, and it isn't slandered to tell the truth, of which I had my court-signed paperwork to back me up. I wasn't disturbing the peace, I was simply and quietly seated outside his home, and just talking to his neighbors about his actions. He was out yelling that I needed to leave, and I quietly stated that I would be happy to leave once I am paid what he legally owes me. Money in my hand, and I was more than willing to stay there and tell anyone that would listen to me why I was camped out there in the first place. The police stated I wasn't doing anything wrong, that it was public property that I was sitting on and I wasn't disturbing the peace, and it isn't slander if it's true. Finally, after an hour of the landlord yelling on his front lawn at the policeman, and at me of course, did his wife come out with the money. She handed the money to the police, of which in turn handed the money to me, and signed complete. I sweetly smiled. I thanked the police deeply and I went home. I have no idea whatever happened to that stupid landlord, or if he's still pulling this garbage like he did on me. But I hope that I at least helped put the fear of God in him, and that he remembers that he can't screw with people, because eventually it will come and bite him right in the butt. This original poster is seriously awesome. They not only worked their way out of a horrible marriage and worked several jobs just to make ends meet, but they also were able to buy a house of their own, while also get out from underneath this awful landlord. And when they tried to sue them illegitimately, they went right back at them and put them right in their place. Like, this really was awesome to see. That landlord was a piece of garbage. They were trying to sue this person for stuff that they didn't even do to the house. That sounds like such a nightmare, to be blamed for something that you had no control over. You treated that place with respect, you did everything correctly, and there's no reason for you to be treated that way. So good for you for getting back at this entitled landlord. They seriously had it coming, and the way you took them down was seriously awesome to see. If you like Am I the Jerk, you're probably going to love Am I the Genius. Check it out, link down below in the description. My entitled manager makes me stay later than I'm allowed to, stating that I have to get everything done, and that I can't leave until everything else is done. To maliciously comply, and as a result she eventually got fired. Here's what happened. So this happened a couple of years ago in December of 2019. I got a job at a higher-end grocery store in the area, as I was planning on saving for when I started college in fall of 2020. The store has all kinds of different departments, from the market cafe, to the pizza and sub shop, to the cheese section, etc. I aced my interview and I was hired in the bakery department. Specifically for breads, the first 4 months was a breeze, but after COVID-19 ramped up, my doctor put me on leave until August. When I returned, a lot of people had already quit the bakery. I was taking college classes now, so I was working night shift part-time from 5 o'clock until 9 o'clock. My department manager by the name of Sarah informed me that they were short-staffed on nights and I might be on my own 1 day a week. I was sure I would be getting help for the rest of the nights, but nope, that didn't happen. Weeks go by and I barely get any help. I'm burning myself doing closing shift on my own along with my own schoolwork. No one was in the dessert or breakfast section, and I can't talk to anyone about it because they're gone by the time I clock in. I complained to the bread manager by the name of John and he told me that he will talk to Sarah since she runs the whole department. So I thought, okay, fine, go ahead and do that. And this is how the conversation went with Sarah. I said to her, "Hey, I wanted to talk to you about the workload. And can't clean up after themselves. I have to do that and my duties, which isn't fair. Are you hiring anybody else for the night shift? I can't keep running around. And I'm using my inhaler so much too." Sarah says, "Oh, yeah, we're having a hard time filling the night shift roles. We could always train you for desserts and breakfast." I say to her, "That's not what I meant. I meant assistance, not more responsibility. I can't do everything in the bakery and close with only 4 hours." Sarah said, "Well, you can just figure something out. You can't leave until everyone else is done." I can't leave until everyone else is done? Okay. Ever since she said that, I started documenting every time I had to do 3 jobs at once. I would take my sweet time when I didn't have class the next day, making sure I clocked out at 11 o'clock each time. The amount of stuff that kept piling up was ridiculous, but I was simply following her instructions. Human Resources noticed my clock in and clock out times and wanted me to come by their office. I told them everything, along with photos I took. Suddenly everything changed. 9 o'clock sharp, they were kicking me out, and whatever was left was for the morning. And eventually this all fell on Sarah. Now Sarah was reprimanded but wasn't fired until she was caught selling 2-year-old expired pumpkin pies, and this was all to customers on Thanksgiving Day. That day surely was a doozy. And while I was shocked, I honestly was not surprised. Yeah, the manager in that situation sounds like a complete loser. Like, first off, you're making a part-time worker pick up all this slack, and this is all ours. Like, seriously, I cannot stand managers who do that. They push everything on somebody else, and then they try to walk away scot-free, as if they don't have any kind of responsibilities at the place they work at. But you know what? It sounds like Sarah got exactly what she deserved in the end, because she was an awful manager, and the fact that she would try and force this on the original poster is proof enough that she had no business being in a manager position. My boyfriend struggles to give me compliments because he's fearful that I'll leave him if I feel too good about myself, and at this point I seriously don't know what to do. For context, we've been together for almost 2 years. I've struggled with low self-esteem my whole life, and it's gotten worse recently. I am currently working on it in therapy. I did some research online, and I found out lots of people struggle with a lack of compliments in relationships. But I haven't seen a post about this particular reason. Throughout our relationship, he's never really complimented me. It's easy for him to compliment his friends or female friends. He would even call them beautiful. But he's told me multiple times that he struggles with complimenting me. He thinks that if I have high self-esteem and think I'm awesome and beautiful, I will just straight up leave him. He also explained to me how compliments were not a big part of his 6-year relationship, which took up most of his young adult life. It was very unhealthy, and she ended up cheating on him. He has a huge abandonment wound from this, understandably, because that was so awful. He knows that I struggle with low self-esteem pretty badly, and when I express to him times where I'm feeling insecure, he's very supportive and reassuring about it, giving me general "I love you, you're beautiful" statements, and I really do appreciate that. We had a talk last night, and he left me a note this morning saying that he finds me so beautiful, and I thought that was really sweet. Since we've talked about it recently and a while ago, he has been complimenting me more, but it honestly feels forced and not genuine to me sometimes, like he's uncomfortable saying it and feels like he has to do it. But still, I really appreciate him trying. I compliment him pretty often because it comes off naturally to me, which is why it's hard for me to understand how, if you're genuinely in love with someone, you wouldn't be gushing over them, at least sometimes. We talked about how I'd really love for him to vocalize how he feels more often, and how not hearing those things has been really hard and had an impact on my self-esteem. In the context of our relationship, it's just extra hard because of the way he could compliment his female best friend. He says this is because he's not scared of a friend leaving him, but a relationship is an entirely different entity. I understand that the thought of abandonment is such a huge fear, and at the same time I'm just struggling with the fact that it's kind of hurtful, because it seems like he doesn't want to feel good about himself in a way because of that fear. He knows it sounds awful too and feels bad about it, so I don't want to bring it up. It's just become a bit painful, because he's seen how heavily I'm struggling with self-esteem, not want me to get better and feel good about myself, otherwise I would just leave him. I'm not sure if that's the truth, or just an excuse because he doesn't find me attractive or something like that, or he just isn't used to complimenting people. He's actively working on complimenting me more, but it doesn't feel specific or genuine at times, and I'm not sure how to address this idea. I just want to feel reassured that the person I'm wanting to continue building a life with thinks nice things about me and wants me to feel good about myself. With him, especially with this being a huge fear of his. What should I do? First off, I think you need to start taking the compliments for face value. I think it's really inappropriate to read too much into it and be like, yeah, you're saying it, but do you mean it? Like, first off, he's obviously never done this before. He has literally no practice at it. And maybe this is the first big step for him to start complimenting you more. So honestly, if he's complimenting you, I think it's really important for you to believe him. Because not believing him honestly sounds obnoxious, and that would get really old really fast. But in that same vein of thought, this guy really doesn't want you to feel good about yourself. Like, seriously, how can you not see that as a red flag? What boyfriend in their right mind would say to you, well, if you feel too good about yourself, you're just gonna leave me? Like, that's honestly insane, and it sounds like he needs to go to therapy or something like that. Because that does not sound like a healthy relationship in the slightest. So hopefully something positive can come from this relationship. Because from the sounds of it, this does not sound healthy slightest, and hopefully things can get worked out sooner than later.